This gorgeous antique Ball Trainmaster pocket watch was sent in by a viewer who stated it was in serious need of a service. These Trainmasters were approved for use on the railways, and so the expectation is that it should be able to keep time to a gain or loss of a maximum of 30 seconds per week. The Ball Watch Company, founded in 1891 by Webb C. Ball, pioneered new safety standards in timekeeping as a result of a horrific and fatal head-on collision between two trains in Kipton, Ohio. More on that later. You know what, I'm going to give it a couple of winds and see if there's any life in this movement as it currently is. Huh, look at that, it actually runs. Now, this watch is lever set, meaning I need to unscrew the bezel to pull on this tiny lever in order to activate time setting mode. This was just one of the few features that came standard on railroad grade pocket watches because it prevented accidental setting of time. For the typical pendant set watch, there's always the potential for the crown to be inadvertently pulled out when slipping it in and out of your pocket. Yeah, the movement is running quite weakly. Visually, I could tell the amplitude is very low. This makes sense because Steve said the timekeeping was all over the place and he couldn't regulate it. Well, that's to be expected when it's performing like that. I'll undo these two case screws to remove the movement out of this beautiful gold-filled swing-out case. As expected, the Timegrapher shows major inconsistencies and issues with this movement's timekeeping abilities. When the amplitude is this low, it will have a problem locking in on a specific number, so you see it shoot up to mid 300 degrees, and that's certainly not what it's running. The beat error is also quite high at over 5 milliseconds. For fixed stud carriers like these old balances have, anything under 1 millisecond is acceptable, but this will need some fine tuning to get as close to zero as possible. I don't know about you, but I'm in love with the circular finishing pattern on this movement plate. That combined with the ball style regulator, the polished gold jewel settings, and the jeweled safety barrel arbor make this movement a true work of art. It's really important to take special care when handling these full plate movements. The balance is very much exposed and it's easy to inadvertently grip the balance wheel with your fingers, so I'll go ahead and remove it now before going any further. As you notice here, there's a dust ring snapped over the edge of the movement. This is another sign of a higher quality grade movement, and it's really helpful to have since it keeps most of the dust and hair out that may occasionally make its way in through the little crevices of the case. I'm loosening these 3 screws that hold the dial against the movement. There are 3 little feet soldered to the underside of the dial, and these screws tighten up against them. This is an enameled dial, and it's in phenomenal condition for its age. When levering off an enameled dial, it's really important to use as little force as possible, and I'm going to just evenly work my way around it to avoid damaging it in any way. It's very easy to crack one of these if prying on it with too much force. The dial washer is removed, and the purpose of that is to serve as a relatively low friction way to keep this hour wheel down against the cannon pinion. The wheel just kind of sits on top and needs to keep its teeth meshed against the minute wheel. The cannon pinion is friction fit on the center wheel arbor. There needs to be enough friction for the center wheel to turn it in order to move the hands, but the keyless works needs to be able to turn the cannon pinion independently of the center wheel in order to set the time. So the friction needs to be perfect to balance both use cases. I'm now about to release the remaining power of the main spring. You can see how turning the crown here moves the click, while I'm about to hold back the click and then allow the power of the spring to unwind itself through the crown and use my fingers to control it. I don't want any power left in the spring when I begin disassembling the train. I'm removing the barrel bridge here, and just take a look at that beautiful engraving. I'm trying my best to remember to use my brass tweezers when handling these decorated parts to reduce the chance of scratching them. This movement features a motor barrel, which is very similar to the traditional going barrel, and the plates have a nice jeweling for the arbor. You'll see the ratchet wheel is fixed to the underside of that assembly. When removing the top plate, it's important to pay attention to the pallet fork, which you can see partially protruding into the recess where the balance wheel was sitting. I carefully lift the plate off the pivots while at the same time sliding it away from the pallet fork. Well, and that's not exactly going to plan. There's some really old oils in these jewels that have hardened over the years. So you can see how it's causing some of these wheels and pivots to get stuck in the plate. I have to be really gentle. The third wheel, escape wheel, and pallet fork are convinced out of their respective jewels. And now I can lift away the fourth wheel and the center wheel, which is also known as the second wheel. Oh yuck, just look at that dirt and debris sitting on those pinion leaves. Any little bit of foreign debris stuck to these wheels and pinions have a significant impact to a watch's performance. Same goes for the old oil, which over time congeals, dries out, and ends up being detrimental to the watch. Oh, and by the way, if you own an old watch that hasn't been serviced in decades, I strongly urge you to put it aside until you can have it cleaned and serviced with fresh oils. Running a watch in this condition over a long period of time will wear down the pivots because this old oil forms an abrasive slurry when combined with all the debris it's absorbed over the years. I'm disassembling the internal winding stem because who knows what else made its way in there, and it really should be cleaned and lubricated as well. Same goes for the click. However, there appears to be some kind of rust or corrosion going on here. Along the click spring itself, you can see how it's staining the plate. So that's not what I want to see on a spring, but I'll take a closer look once it's removed. I was afraid of that. It's so brittle at this point, it's just falling apart. On the bright side, I'm glad this happened to me and not to Steve some year or two down the line. I'll be on the hunt for a replacement, but in the meantime, I'll work on disassembling this mainspring barrel. As I mentioned earlier, this design is what's known as a motor barrel, and it's not that different from the going barrel you see on most pocket watches. Like the going barrel, when winding the watch, a central hub rotates to coil the mainspring, while the toothed barrel remains stationary. And so when the watch is running, the barrel rotates to drive the train as the first wheel in the train, while the arbor is stationary. The difference here is that the staff inside the tooth barrel is rigidly fixed to it and therefore serves as more of an axle through the hollow mainspring hub. So it's the hollow hub that's attached to the ratchet wheel, and that's what remains stationary. For this reason, the jeweling you saw on the plate has a functional benefit as it provides that nice low friction surface as the barrel rotates around that axle. The mainspring itself looks to be in good shape, but I'll still see about replacing it with a fresh one. This lever set keyless works is a pretty common design found on 18-sized pocket watches. It consists of the yoke, which I'm removing now, the crown wheel in the center, the intermediate winding wheel on the right, and the intermediate setting wheel on the left. I'll go ahead and remove the setting lever and the springs, which fortunately don't have the type of corrosion that ruined the click spring. All plates and components will go into the cleaning machine as per usual, but I still like to jumpstart that process by manually scrubbing the most stubborn grime, which tends to exist on the inner walls of these hole jewels. Whenever I chat with someone who's looking for advice about how to deal with a weak amplitude after a service, I usually ask two questions. 1. Did you peg all the jewel holes during the pre-cleaning? And 2. Did you replace the main spring? If the answer is yes, then sure, let's consider pinion wear, scored pivots, etc., but most times it comes down to fouling within the jewels and the bushings. The jewels with the greatest impact on performance, of course, are the balance jewels. These are capped, and I'm separating the cap jewel, which is rubbed into a setting, from the whole jewel so that they can be cleaned separately. I'll do the same for the upper jewels, but first I need to free it from the balance by removing that hairspring stud. By the way, of all the hairspring stud carriers I've seen, this is by far my favorite design. The way the stud can slide in horizontally, rather than being pushed up into a hole, makes it so much easier to install and remove it. The balance will be stored somewhere safe, but first let's take a peek at all the debris stuck to the pivots, which still appear to be in great shape. Sometimes I'll get a balance where the pivots are bent but not broken. The watch will run like that, but the performance will be extremely erratic. The hole jewel and cap jewel settings are friction fit, so they'll need to be punched out so I can separate them for cleaning. The staking set provides a safe and simple way to do this. So you're probably wondering what I'm doing with this acoustic guitar string, the B string to be exact. Well, as it turns out, I couldn't find a replacement for that click spring online, and there weren't any viable donor movements that didn't look good enough to take a chance on. So it's time to improvise. This isn't the first time you've seen me make a spring from a guitar string, and I promise I won't sing to you like in that other video. But these strings are perfect in that they have the right level of toughness required to serve the function as intended. I'm using various hand vices, pliers, and other tools to shape the spring into the same shape as the original. It's an iterative process, but eventually I had something I could test fit into the plate. I'm using Molykote DX grease to add a little lubrication between the tip of the spring and the edge of the click. With the click installed, it looks like my makeshift spring will work out in the end. The setting lever spring and the yoke spring are installed into the dial side of the movement plate. I can then fit the setting lever. Mobius D5 is used to lubricate the rotational surface of the lever. There's a little post on the elbow of that lever that's inserted into the loop on the end of that spring. Mobius D5 is the type of oil I'm using to lubricate the various higher friction surfaces in the movement, such as here in the keyless work. Even the posts underneath the yoke receive this lubrication. DX grease is used on the metal-to-metal hard sliding contact points where the setting lever presses against the yoke, which activates and deactivates time setting mode. The winding pinion is lubricated before it is fitted with its retaining bridges, which are then screwed down to the main plate. Notice the serial number stamped into this part. You'll likely see this number on other parts of the movement as well, and the fact that these numbers all match each other is really important to a collector. Each of the train wheels is carefully lowered to the plate, inserting their pivots into the respective jewel holes. The third wheel, second wheel, fourth wheel, and the escape wheel are now in place. I won't install the pallet fork here yet. Remember, it needs to protrude horizontally through the opening in the upper plate. But before we get to that, I'll reinstall the balance jewels. And I do have the option to oil them now, but I'll install them first and use my version 1A automatic oiler to deposit the precise amount of oil through the whole jewel onto the end stone. The oil in the reservoir of the auto oiler is Mobius 9010, which is the same oil used on all the pivots in the train of wheels. Likewise, the jewels in their settings are reinstalled here as well, again using the staking set to ensure they're pressed in flat. As before, I then plan on oiling these jewels using the automatic oiler. One key benefit of using these automatic oilers is, well, there are two really, is one, doing so after the jewels are installed means there's no risk of the droplet being disturbed and potentially wicked away. And the second reason is the precise deposit means there's an equal amount on both the upper and lower pivots, which results in more consistent and equal performance of the balance in both the dial up and dial down positions. I've developed a habit of test fitting the balance. Sometimes a previous watch repairer may have intentionally shifted the jewel settings to adjust for end shake. There's no real way to determine that otherwise. By pressing the jewels back in, I would have then eliminated that fine-tuning. So this tests for good end shake and freedom of movement. It's nice doing this now before everything is installed, because then I can see how the balance performs in isolation. So, in the end, if I'm not satisfied with certain aspects of the movement's overall performance, I can essentially rule out any such issues with the balance. Here, I'm demonstrating how the stud can be installed when the balance is already on the plate. This is more convenient than doing so on a typical stud carrier. Of course, use common sense when tightening these screws by not pressing down with excessive force. It doesn't take much to hold the stud in place. And what I'll typically do is lift the plate and turn it into various positions to ensure nothing's rubbing and verify the wheel continues to spin without trouble in any position. Each of the pallet fork jewel faces receive a droplet of Mobius 941. And this is the special way I learned to install the pallet fork, upside down on the top plate, because it must horizontally protrude into the area where the fork horn meets the balance. It's held in place using a small piece of Rodico, while I flip the plate over and maneuver it onto the main plate over the rest of the train of wheels. This part's done off camera, but I then hold the movement at eye level and use my tweezers to help each of the pivots find their respective jewel holes. Before tightening the plate down, I do one final sanity check by manipulating the center wheel and observing the action that results in the free movement of the pallet fork. I'm still waiting for the replacement mainspring to arrive, but since this one's in good condition, I'm going to run a little experiment to see how the old mainspring performs. Then I'll swap it out for the new one and compare the results. The arbor you see is fixed to the barrel and will run through the mainspring hub that's attached to the ratchet wheel. The ratchet wheel needs to mesh with the click, so as I lower the assembly onto the plate, I'm going to go ahead and reach over here to temporarily pull the click out of the way so the mainspring arbor and ratchet wheel can be fully seated. Now it can be fixed to the main plate with these two screws. This beautifully inscribed jeweled barrel bridge with the matching circular damascening is now reinstalled. All train wheel pivots are lubricated with Mobius 9010. I got into the habit of doing this under the microscope, and I highly recommend it if you have one because I had a tendency to use too much oil. It's very easy to do so. It's not until I see it up close at this magnification that I can really observe what the oil is doing. You'll be surprised how little oil these pivots actually need, and over-oiling is, in some ways, worse than no oil at all. Oil migration can get on the pinion leaves and kill the amplitude, among other things, and can also wick the oil away from the pivots themselves. I'm going to install the cannon pinion now, but the minute wheel and the hour wheel will come later, since those two are just held down by the dial washer and the dial. They'd just flop off if I turned over the movement. This is always part of the repair I look forward to the most. I'm now inserting the balance such that the impulse jewel lands on the receiving end of the pellet fork horn, and then I just carefully rotate it around. And there's life! Always satisfying to see. And it looks strong too. Now remember, at this point I'm still using the original main spring, so I don't think it's running to its full potential, but let's pop it on the Timegrapher to see how it's doing. So north of 200 degrees amplitude isn't bad. Beat error is perfect at 0 milliseconds, and timekeeping loss is in the single digits of seconds per day.
72 hours later.
The new mainspring arrived, and I've gone ahead and removed the old spring in preparation. Normally, the painted side of the holder faces up, while the spring is pressed into the barrel. The tail end of this spring uses a double-braced T-hook, and that needs to be aligned with the small slot milled into the barrel. The T needs to land in this slot, and that's what prevents the spring from slipping around in the barrel while it's being wound up. Then the barrel lid can be reinstalled and everything else can be fitted back to the movement, same as earlier. It's been at least 24 hours, the oil has run in, and I'm now regulating the movement. By using this little screw on the ball regulator, I can speed up or slow down the timekeeping to fine-tune performance. The new mainspring improved amplitude quite a bit here. Remember, it was only 212 degrees and that was in the horizontal positions. The watch is keeping great time now across all the positions. Finishing up, I can now install the minute wheel, the hour wheel, and dial washer before the dial is then lowered down and secured using the 3 screws along the rim of the movement. As mentioned earlier, the Kipton disaster served as a wake-up call for Congress and the Lakeshore officials, leading them to enlist the expertise of Webb C. Ball to revolutionize timekeeping and to drive new sets of standards to be used on the railways. Ball immediately introduced a railroad standard requiring watches to meet certain criteria. These criteria included features like a plain white dial, bold black hands and Arabic numerals, a winding stem at 12 o'clock, a minimum of 17 joules, a double roller on the balance, lever set functionality, and accuracy to within a maximum of 30 seconds gain or loss per week. These strict standards actually form the basis of the COSC certifications placed on today's modern chronometers. But Ball didn't stop there. He went on to create a service program requiring railroad employees to bring their watches every 2 weeks for inspection. This commitment to accuracy and reliability became a hallmark of railroad timekeeping. From 1894 to 1954, Hamilton Watch Company produced over 100,000 watches specifically for Webb C. Ball. These watches, starting with grades 936 and 937, quickly evolved into the widely recognized official railroad standard and other private label markings, and eventually with grade number 999, an example of which takes center stage in this video. Since Ball's new standards were introduced, there was only one other railway disaster in history that could be blamed on a faulty watch. So it not only prevented disasters like Kipton, but also ensured that when anyone asked a railroad man the time, they could trust the answer. Webb C. Ball's legacy lives on in the precision and reliability of the official railroad standard and the iconic grade 999 watches, marking a transformative era in the history of timekeeping. I'd like to thank Steve for sending me this watch in for service. He sent in other excellent examples of iconic watches and has always been great to work with. It truly is a privilege to get to work on such gorgeous timepieces, and I enjoyed sharing the experience with you all, so I hope you at least learned something from this video today, but if not, I hope you at least found it enjoyable. Thanks for fixing watches with me today, and I'll see you in the next one.